Thanks, Alice. Or Alex. I said Alice, but that's from this morning, isn't it? Yeah. To say that this is going to be a bit of a topic shift and a bit of a pace shift is kind of an understatement, I think, folks. But hopefully, I can promise that the physicists will understand everything that I say. Whether or not you find it interesting or relevant is another question. But at least you'll hopefully keep your attention post-lunch. Okay, so what I want to start with is the distinction that someone mentioned yesterday, the distinction between the A series and the B series. The series of positions running from past, present to future, being the A series, and the B series being the series running from earlier to later. With respect to the A series, your own current location in time is critical, and times that are quite relevant to that with reference to that. But that is not the case with the B series. Now, as far as I understand it, this distinction is very much featured within kind of metaphysical debates within philosophy. But as psychologists, we can also think about whether this distinction maps onto anything that we might recognise as relevant to us. So, you might try and map on this distinction to the distinction between two different types of frameworks. And what I mean by frameworks here are just kind of representations or processes that you use in order to locate events within a particular domain, or locate points in time, or to orient yourself within a particular domain. Now, the term framework is most commonly used within the spatial literature rather than the temporal literature, but I'll adopt it in this case for time as well. Okay, so one question you might ask here if you're a developmental psychologist is whether there's any developmental priority with regard to perspectival temporal frameworks in which your own position is critical, versus non-perspectival temporal frameworks. So you could call that the developmental priority question. Now, in the course of the talk, I will try and give an answer to that question, but what I'm going to say is that you can't really answer that question without considering two other distinctions, in particular the first of the distinctions that I'm going to mention now. Okay. So the other distinctions I think that we need in play are these. So we've got the distinction between perspectival and non-perspectival frameworks. I think we also need the distinction between temporal frameworks that allow orientation with respect to phase and temporal frameworks that allow orientation with respect to particular times. Now, this is a distinction most closely associated with the philosopher John Campbell, who discusses it at length in his book Past, Space and Self. What do we mean here? Well, some ways of keeping track of time involve simply representing or using, in some way, repeating cycles. So imagine that you have your breakfast outside every morning at 8 o'clock, you're a creature of habits, and what you find is that the local bees tend to roll up about 8 o'clock every morning and start to try and eat your marmalade that you're putting on your toast. Okay? Now, those bees are reliably coming along at 8 o'clock every morning, but so they've got some way of keeping track of time, but the way that they have of keeping track of time is entirely tied to the repeating daily cycle here. Now, for you sitting in the room right now, that isn't, of course, the only way that you have of keeping track of time. Not only can you locate breakfast within the phase of the daily cycle, but you can also locate this morning's breakfast, and you can assign it a unique temporal location that's different from yesterday morning's breakfast, that's different from breakfast in the future, and so on. So we sitting in the room right now, adults, we can think of temporal locations as being locations that are unique, rather than repeating. Okay. So that's one kind of simple distinction. The other distinction I want to make is between event-dependent and event-independent thought about time. Now, I think somebody yesterday mentioned something similar to this type of distinction. So let's start by thinking about it in the spatial case. So in the spatial case, it seems clear to me that I can think about this particular space over here independently of any objects that are in it. You can put a chair in it, take the chair away, and nevertheless, I still think of it as being that particular space. We can also ask whether people can think of time in a similar way, whether people can think of locations in time independent of any events that might actually be located at those particular points in time. And I want to call that event-independent thought about time. Now, our clock and calendar system is a perfect system for referring to locations in time in an event-independent way. You can use it to refer to any location you want in time without having to specify the events that occur at that particular point in time. And we can contrast that with ways of thinking about time that might be closely tied up with the actual events that happen at those points in time. And I think this is potentially a distinction that Chris might be coming back to in his talk. Now, what I want to do for the course of the talk is really think about how these three distinctions relate to developmental issues, and what would count as evidence for the different modes of thought that I've been talking about. So, the first key question that I wanted to answer, which was, this isn't working out, which was here, which is the developmental priority question. The other question I want to try and answer towards the end of the talk is whether these latter two distinctions are actually orthogonal to each other in any kind of meaningful way. Now, what I should say here is that unlike a lot of the debates that was clear to me, and a lot of the debates within physics and philosophy, there's a lot of people working on these issues. They're kind of entrenched positions of different sides, and people are taking different lines on these things. These questions that I'm just mentioning to you are not live questions within the developmental psychology literature at all. So really I've kind of got to speculate to some extent in terms of what answers I might give to these questions. But nevertheless, we might try and put together answers to these questions based on the little pieces of empirical evidence that we do have in this area. Okay, so let me start by thinking about children's earliest ways of being oriented in time. Now, a lot of research in the 1980s and 1990s established fairly conclusively that children are very good at acquiring what we might call scripts, at acquiring what we might call representations of familiar repeated event sequences. These representations seem to be critical in terms of children making sense of the world. They acquire them quite rapidly and they rely on them quite heavily. So what do I mean by a script? Well, say for example, a bedtime script. So what happens when you go to bed? You have your bath, you get your pajamas on, you drink your milk, listen to a story, you brush your teeth and you go to bed. Okay, so that's an example of a familiar script that children might have. Now there's two things we could say about this. The first thing we could say is that, of course, that this is a set of regularities that's been imposed on the world. But secondly, and I think more interestingly, in its fundamental form, what we have here is essentially a non-perspectival temporal representation. What we've represented here are the sequence in which events happen themselves. So, however, what I want to say, well, in their most basic form, scripts, you could say, are non-perspectival representations. However, children, of course, need to be able to use these scripts in some ways in order to orient themselves in time and in order to kind of generate expectations. So, when a particular script is unfolding, it seems clear to me that children must know where they are within the script. They must be able to orient themselves within the script. So we might call this perspectival thought within the context of a script. And what would perspectival thought look like within the context of a script? Well, you might kind of know where you are in the event sequence, but know where you are in a very particular way. Know where you are in the sense of knowing what events have been completed and what. I said a bit about a laser pointer that actually, this one's kind of fading a little bit. Okay, so know where you are in the sense of you know which events have been completed and which events are yet to come. Now, we might say, well, what is missing here? What is different to more mature ways of thinking about time? And I think two things are missing here so far. Well, first of all, representing an event's temporal location within a script is, of course, not the same as representing its unique location in time. It's not yet thought about particular or unique points in time. It's not yet orientation with respect to particular times, to use the phrase I discussed earlier. So, for example, we still don't know if children can distinguish between different occurrences of the script. What makes today's bedtime different from yesterday's bedtime, different to one in the future, and so on. Secondly, children might have very good scripts of different domains. So for example, they might have a very good script of what happens when you go to the supermarket or what happens when you go to the doctors or something. But say two events like this happen, what way do children have of thinking about the temporal relationships between these two events? If all they have, if we assume for the moment all they have are these scripts, then they have nothing to say about what the temporal relationships are between these two events. Okay, so we haven't thought about particular times yet. And also, as I've described perspectival, yeah?
So the bit that's missing is the kind of analog of when you sort of abstract it away from the chair being here to the space that's there and other things might be.
I haven't got, yeah, I'm just about to do that. Okay.
But that's what you're saying that children don't have, they just have the scripts, right?
I'm just about to say that, yeah. Yeah, okay. I'm also going to say that thinking about the status of events, okay, is not the same as thinking about events that's located in the past, present, and future. We haven't got event-independent thought about time here, okay? Children seem to be, what I would argue is that they can think of some events as being completed, some events as ongoing, some events as yet to come, but that's not the same as representing events as located in the past, present, and future, and they're not representing that kind of relationship. So you could say that there's an important sense in which they don't yet have event-independent thought about time. That's what you could say.
What age are you talking about?
We're talking, sorry, I'll come to here in a second, but we're talking about sort of 2 to 3 year olds here at this stage. Okay, so just to mention here, and I'm not an expert in this debate, Chris would know a lot more about this debate than me. The idea that when children first start using tensed forms, what they're doing is not marking tense at all, but marking something about the status of events, is actually in and of itself a debate within the psycholinguistics literature. It's called the affect before tense debate, and as I say, it's a debate that Chris would be familiar with. Okay, but I'm just name checking that, really. So what I want to turn now to thinking about is what would count as evidence for other ways of thinking about time. So what might count as evidence for orientation with respect to particular times, and what might count as evidence for event-independent temporal representation. Now, I don't have knockdown evidence in terms of answers to these questions, but I'll try and introduce some of the relevant literature, and you can make your own minds up about it. Okay, so let's start with evidence for orientation with respect to particular times rather than with respect to repeating cycles or phases. Well, let's go with this idea here. Let's at least run with this idea that potentially one hallmark of being able to represent times uniquely is that you can think about the temporal relationships between any two events at all, even events that are not thematically or semantically related to each other in any way. That you can think about what the temporal relationships between those two events might be, because you should have a kind of unified temporal framework that allows you to do that. A single unified temporal framework. So now we can ask, when can children do this? Is there any evidence about when children can do this? And let me mention just a few experiments on this. So this is the person you really should have here doing this talk, a guy called William Friedman, who's done a large number of talks on this issue. He's a fantastic researcher. And back in 1991, he did what was quite an ambitious study. He went out into children's nursery schools, and he carried out two events. Well, actually, he didn't do it. He had assistants to do it. So this is back in the 1990s, and video cameras, believe it or not, were still relatively novel to children in those days. So he showed them a demonstration in which someone came and showed them how a video recorder worked, and they made a little video of the class, and so on. So it was kind of an interesting and exciting thing for the children. 7 weeks later, a different person came in and gave children a demonstration of how to brush their teeth properly. So they brought in this giant toothbrush, and it made it again quite exciting and interesting to the children. But there was no relationship between these two events. Entirely different sets of people came in and did these sorts of things. And then he asked children about a week later, which one of these two events happened a long time ago and which happened a short time ago. And there are a number of children in the study, but the age range I'm going to focus on here is the 4-year-olds. And what he found was that 4-year-olds indeed could answer this question. Now, what I want to say to you is that 4-year-olds have not got a clue about the clock and calendar system. Okay, certainly not about the calendar system. They just have not got a clue. And he did indeed ask children questions like, what months did these events happen ago, how many weeks ago, and so on. They could not answer any of those questions, the 4-year-olds. Nevertheless, they answered the question correctly about the relative order in which the events had happened. Now, what he argues is that there's potentially a simple way you can do this. You can do this on something like the basis of the kind of vividness or the strength of memory that you have for each of the events. So the videotaping event happened relatively long time ago, so you've got this kind of weak memory trace of it. The toothbrushing event only happened a week ago, so you've got some sort of salient and vivid memory of it. And that's what he suggests children do in order to make that discrimination. Now, let me just mention one other experiment that he's done on similar lines. So this is an experiment in which he didn't just ask children to make judgments about pairs of events, he now asked them to locate a series of past events that had happened over the last year, okay? And he used a kind of spatial, like a ruler task. So he had a ruler sitting out on the table, and one end of the ruler was meant to represent now, and the other end of the ruler was meant to represent a long time ago. And he told children that this was the long time ago year when you were just a little baby. And what children had to do was then locate events on this spatial display. And along the x-axis here, we've got the actual distance of the events in the past, and along the y-axis, we've got where children placed the events in the scale. And what you can see here is that, okay, there's not a linear relationship here, but there's some relationship here, at least up to this point, between how long ago the events happened and the distance that children judge them to be in time. Now, once they get quite far away, there's no further discrimination here. And bear in mind again that children do not have anything like a notion of the calendar system, or even how seasons or public holidays and so on unfold in the year. Now, if children are indeed locating events in the past in this way, you might think that they may struggle when you ask them questions about the future, and you would be right in that intuition. So here's data from, it's just a little piece of data from a larger study on something completely different that I carried out last year, the year before. We had children in May time, we were testing them, and we asked them about pairs of events in the past. So we said to them, okay, Christmas time and Easter time, I remember May, we were testing them in May, which one of these events happened a long time ago and which one happened a short time ago? And we got them back in a separate testing session, and now we asked them about events. We said that were in the future. We said, here's this is a picture of your summer holidays, where you're going to go on holiday with your family. Here's Halloween. I want you to tell me which one of these events, or which one of these things is going to happen in a short time, and which one is going to happen in a long time. Now, what you find here is that 5-year-olds can do both of these things. But 4-year-olds struggle with regard to the future. So they don't perform, chance levels here is 50%, they don't perform above chance levels at the age of 4 with regard to future events. Okay, so what does this tell us? Well, what this tells us is that when children first start making these judgments, potentially they seem to be doing it on something on the basis of something like distance from now, potentially using something like what we might call memory trace strength or vividness or something like that. And intrinsically, this is a perspectival or kind of A-series mode of thought. Now,
are you trying to suggest that the ones in this audience who are attached to the A-series haven't grown up over 4 years?
I don't want to make that kind of value judgment. Okay, so let's assume, for the sake of argument, that children at this age of about 3 to 4 years are operating with something like this. Okay, so they've got some sort of sense of farther from now stretching into the past, farther from now stretching into the future. Okay, but nevertheless, they haven't just got orientation with respect to phase. They're potentially capable of thinking of times as unique. Okay, if this is what they've got. So every time point in here is indeed unique if this is what they've got. Okay, now, however, it only gets us the uniqueness of temporal locations if we make a further assumption, and that further assumption has to be that children do indeed have a grip on the past-future distinction. Otherwise, they'd be enough to differentiate a certain distance in the past from a certain distance in the future. So now we would come back to is whether children of this age genuinely make a proper distinction between past and future. And here we really do have actually a viewpoint in the literature that it's possible to assess and argue for or against. This is William Friedman's viewpoint. So he says that although the distinction between past and future is a fundamental component of adults' mental time travel, as people talked about at length yesterday, the contrast between these two categories of experience is not early developing. That's what he believes. Okay. Now, why does he believe that? He believes it because of some other data that he has. So this is William Friedman's data again. And this is the same study that I talked about earlier, where children had to locate past events along a ruler. Okay, so they have to use this spatial scale to show how long ago an event happened. And now children are asked to place their birthday on this scale in terms of how long ago it happened. And this is how long ago children's birthdays actually happened, okay, and this is where they place them on the scale. Now what you can see here is that there's a nice relationship between distance in the past and where children place these on the scale, but only up to a certain point. And it's not that it flattens out here, in fact it dips down. Well, what does that mean? What that means is that children whose birthdays actually happened a long time ago are saying that their birthdays happened a short time ago. Well, why is that? It's because these birthdays here are about to happen. Okay, they're about to happen in the next few weeks for these children. Okay, so these children are actually judging that these events that are about to happen potentially happened a short time ago. You also see the reverse error. So this is another study. I did say you should have Friedman when you're giving this talk. It's another study by William Friedman. And here he's now asking children to make judgments about the future locations of events. And he's using a similar type of methodology. So he actually has a picture of a road that stretches out into the future, and the end of the road is supposed to be when you're growing up, and the start of the road is supposed to be when you leave the room right now after having done this task. So they're meant to lay events out along a spatial scale. Now this is distance in the future, and these are, in fact, he's using kind of public holidays here, the summertime, Halloween, Christmas, and Valentine's Day. And these children are tested at the end of February. And this is the distance rate in the future that children give for these different events. Now, the 4-year-olds, perhaps not surprisingly, are hopeless here. They do not discriminate between distances in the future. The 5-year-olds here do something interesting. So they do okay in that they say the summer holidays are closer in the future than Christmas and Halloween. But then we've got the same error again as we had in the previous slide. They now say that Halloween, or that Valentine's Day is a short time away in the future. But Valentine's Day actually happened just a few weeks ago. So on the basis of this kind of data, he seriously questions whether children at this age actually have got a proper past-future distinction. Okay. Right, so what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is that children have some sort of notion of the now and the not now that's not properly discriminated in terms of whether it's past or future. My hunch is that this is not true, okay, and certainly in this age range that we're talking about. If you look at children's spontaneous languages where they're talking about events in the past and the future, they do not spontaneously seem to confuse the categories. Now, that's not to say they always use tense correctly. Clearly, like even a second language learner as an adult, if you're learning another language, you'll make errors with regards to tense constructions. But nevertheless, they don't seem to systematically talk about future events as if they've happened or past events as if they're yet to happen and so on. There's also formal comprehension studies in which you give children sentences and you ask them, you look at how they understand those sentences, and again, you don't see evidence of systematic past future errors. I just want to mention just one little other piece of evidence, and you may or may not think this is relevant, but you might, and some people, again, this links up potentially with some of the issues that people were talking about already. You might ask, when do children understand something about the asymmetry of time? So when do they realise that causes precede effects, for example, and that time's arrow only goes in a particular direction? And let me just mention briefly one little piece of evidence that we have about this. This is a study by myself and a PhD student of mine, and actually I'll not describe the whole study in detail. It's a replication of a study from the 1970s, so I'll just give you a general sense of it. So in this study, what happened was that we're now trying to look at whether children understand that causes precede effects. And we use this little piece of apparatus here. The events we're talking about happen fairly close together in time. They're not spaced out over time. So we have this little piece of apparatus, and you can drop a red ball down here, and if you do, a teddy bear pops up. You can also drop a white ball down here, and if you do, a teddy bear pops up. And you should children are shown that no matter which side you drop the ball on, the teddy bear will pop up. So now you move on to the test trials, and you show them. You drop a ball down, the teddy bear pops up. You drop the white ball down, and that's the end of the test trial. Now you control for the temporal gap between these events so that it's identical, and then you ask children which of the two balls made the teddy bear pop up. Now the right answer here is to say that it's the red ball. By 4 years, of course, by 4 years children get this, they ace this completely. They don't make any errors, or virtually no errors on this particular task. And when they do make errors, it seems to be because they've forgotten the order in which the events actually occurred. Okay, so personally I think it's unlikely, certainly by this age, by the age that we're talking about, is that children do not have a past-future category distinction. I think it's likely that they do. However, I think that precisely because children are relying on these perspectival temporal frameworks, precisely because that's all they've got, is this perspectival thing. They haven't got any other system in play here. They haven't got the non-perspectival framework that we've got for thinking about time. Then I think they're particularly susceptible to making erroneous judgments about the locations of some types of past and future events. But I don't think that that means that they haven't got the categories in place. Okay, you may not agree, but we can pick that up if people are interested in. Okay, so now we're in a position to come back to the question, one of the questions that we started out with. And one of the questions was, which of these two ways of thinking about time is developmentally more basic? And I think what I would try to argue is that there's no straightforward answer you can give to this question. When we looked at the case of orientation with respect to fields, we talked about children's scripts, which they seem to be heavily reliant on. And those scripts seem to be, they seem to me to be non-perspectival representations. Children can orient themselves within the script, so it's a bit like having a map that you take out, which is non-perspectival, but you can, in order to make use of the map, you have to know where you are in it. Similarly with the scripts, they're non-perspectival, but in order for them to be useful to you, you need to know where you are in them. So with respect to orientation with respect to fields, you might say the developmentally basic representation is non-perspectival. Orientation with respect to particular times, I think it would be very hard to argue that it's something other than perspectival in nature. And I think the data that I've shown you potentially, hopefully, might convince you that that's the case. So essentially, we can't really answer this question here without thinking about this distinction is the idea. Okay, so I've probably nearly taken my half hour, but I wanted to say a little bit about event-dependent and event-independent, if that's okay. Temporal representation. Now, the common calendar system is a fantastic way of representing locations of events in time, and it's completely event-independent, as I said. However, what we know by now is that it's mastered relatively late in development, so anyone who has a child will probably have been quite surprised and frustrated at how difficult children seem to find learning the common calendar system, and often they don't have proper mastery of it until middle to late childhood. So 7 to 8-year-olds, for example, might still be struggling with aspects of that system. And often in schools, a lot of time is spent trying to explicitly teach it to them. So learning our canonical event-independent temporal representation system is not straightforward to us. Moreover, you might argue that the developmental challenge that you face in the temporal case is rather different to the spatial case. So in the spatial case, for example, I can re-encounter particular spaces with or without objects in them. I can see them with one object in and then with a different object in and so on. Obviously, I can't do that in the temporal case. And moreover, when people talk to me, when adults talk to me about time when you're a child, they can only talk to you about, refer to points in time in one of two ways. They can either refer to those points in time using the clock and calendar system, which you're not going to understand anyway if you're a 4-year-old, or they can refer to those points in time by referring to the events that happen in those points in time. There is no other way that they can do it. Okay? So you might say that children face a particularly tough developmental challenge if they're ever going to learn, if they're ever going to learn something, some kind of notion of time which is event independent. And both of these types of considerations might lead to the viewpoint that event-independent temporal representation is some kind of sophisticated cultural construction. And I think what Chris is going to argue is that it's, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're going to argue that it's also culturally specific, so that it may not be something that's shared by all cultures. Okay, so what do we want to say then? Well, I don't think we want to stop the debate at this point. I mean, I think that what we potentially could try to do is look for evidence for event-independent thought about time, without actually looking directly at children's mastery of the clock and calendar system at all. And what I'm going to try and convince you of is that there may be a primitive way that children have of thinking about time in an event-independent way that's very different to, or that's much more developmentally basic than use of the clock and calendar system. And in order to convince you of this, what I have to do is make another distinction. And the distinction is a straightforward one. It's between simple updating and retrospectively reasoning about temporal order. Now imagine you're a child observing states of the world changing. And an object gets put in the blue cupboard, sometimes somebody comes along, they get the object out and they put it into, the red cupboard, they get the object out and put it into the blue cupboard. You update your model of the world now, and when someone asks you where the toy is, you straightforwardly can tell them that it's in the blue cupboard. So that kind of simple update, it doesn't require any thought about time at all, let alone event-independent thought about time. Okay, but imagine you're in a different situation. Imagine some events have indeed occurred, but you haven't seen them, okay? You haven't observed them. But retrospectively, you're given the information to fill in these particular slots. Now, this sounds abstract, but I'm going to show an example in which we try and get children to do this in a moment. So imagine that you set up a task in which children know that events have happened, they know two events have happened, but they don't know what those are, and critically, they do not know the order in which the events have actually happened. Okay? You only provide that information to them retrospectively, and now they have to make an inference about the current state of the world. Okay? So you could potentially argue that under those circumstances, children have to think about these particular points in time as somehow empty slots which have to be filled up in some sort of way once you get the relevant pieces of information. Well, how do we possibly look at this in children? Well, Christoph and I have devised a number of tasks of this sort, and I'm just going to describe one of them to you because it's sort of the cutest one. This is known as the Hairbrush task. And in this task, I'll not even talk through any of the text, okay? This is one of our props for the task here. There's a little doll's house, and the doll's house has got different rooms in it, and there's two characters here, John and Peter. And John and Peter do different things in the little rooms of this house, but they always do them in the same order. So John always goes first, and then Peter always goes second. Okay, and children see this, and this is explained to them. So they go around doing this in the different rooms of the house, and then they get to, sorry, it hasn't come out very well on the slide here. They get to this room in the house, which is the bathroom, which you can't see very well here, but there are two cupboards. There's a blue cupboard and a red cupboard, and there's a little hairbrush here. Okay, so now the dolls go into this room, and the door is closed behind them. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Where? Yeah, okay. So they go into the room and the door is closed behind them. Okay, and at this point, you tell them one of the dolls gets the hairbrush and puts it in one cupboard. The other doll gets the hairbrush and then puts it in the other cupboard. But you don't tell them which cupboard which doll puts them in. So they can't, it's like they're not in the situation in which they can observe states of the world changing. Now they're going to have to make a retrospective inference. So then you bring the dolls out again. And you say, I'm going to show you photographs of which cupboard each doll put the hairbrush into. And you do indeed do that. Okay, so as an adult, and then you ask them where is the hairbrush right now. Now as an adult, you should find this trivially easy. Well, he put it in the red cupboard because he's John, he's always goes first, he put it in the red cupboard. Then there's Peter, he put it in the blue cupboard, so it must be in the blue cupboard right now. Okay, so for an adult and for an older children, this is a retrospective inference that's extremely easy. Now, what do we find? Well, we've run a number of series of studies using this task and related tasks. Typically, 5-year-olds are above chance on this kind of task, but our per 4-year-olds, remember chance is 50% here, don't tend to pass this kind of task. So, the essentially what we might have here is a very simple form of event-independent temporal representation in which children have to sort of fill these slots retrospectively with the information that you provide them with. Okay, of that sort. Now, what else do I want to say about event-independent temporal representation? Well, you could also argue, and I'm not going to argue this in any depth, but you could also argue that very simple event-independent thought about time might be in evidence in other situations too. So, for example, some of the formal planning tasks that we give to children arguably require children to think about there essentially being a set of future slots in time that they have to fill in particular ways in order to achieve the outcome that they want to achieve. Okay? So you could say that some types of planning tasks also potentially require thinking about future points in time in this kind of slot-like way or empty way, where they then fill in with different kind of events mentally before they actually carry out the task. And there may also be some uses of temporal language and on the comprehension of temporal language that you might argue also requires event-independent thought about time, and I can come back to that if people are interested in it. So what I want to say about event-independent thought about time, well, first that it's not developmentally basic. However, in its most primitive form of this kind, I think it's unlikely to be a sophisticated cultural construction. However, I don't think this is a dichotomous distinction, and I think it's probably likely to be largely a matter of degree, so degree of event-independent representation about time. Okay, so now this is the very last bit of the talk, and if I could have just a few minutes to finish up, Alex. I want to come back to these two distinctions and this question that I said I would finish up with. So we've talked already about orientation with respect to fears and particular times, and we've also talked about event-independent and event-dependent notions of time. And I want to think now about what the relationship is between these distinctions. Are they completely orthogonal to each other, or in fact are they tied in some kind of important way? Well, we've talked about children's scripts, and we've said children's scripts they allow orientation with respect to fears, but they only allow event-dependent temporal cognition. And on the other hand, we've got this notion of the clock and calendar system, which allows both of those things: event-independent thought about time, and it's also orientation with respect to particular times rather than fears. What I want to think about now is whether there can be crossovers in those two kinds of categories. Well, first of all, is it possible to have orientation with respect to fears that is event-independent? Well, I think the answer to this question is fairly quickly yes. So if we go back to our example of the little bee turning up to get his marmalade at 8 o'clock every morning, here we've got a time-keeping system that allows orientation with respect to fears, but the times are defined here as states of an internal clock. So I think you could probably describe this as an event-independent way of keeping track of time, because really what you've got is just states of an internal clock that are changing independently of the events out there. Okay, so I think that answering that question you might think is relatively straightforward. Here's the more difficult question. Is it possible to have orientation with respect to particular times that is event-independent? Now you might say already that question is nonsensical because you're already talking about particular times, and if children can represent particular times, then they're already represented times in a way that's event-independent. But I want to convince you that there's at least a little scope here for developing the idea that this is indeed possible. So I want to argue that in its most basic form, potentially orientation with respect to particular times can be event-independent if time points are defined only in terms of the events that occupy them. Now, what I want to say here? Well, we've suggested already that maybe 4-year-olds are operating about with something like this. So potentially, if this is correct, then children do have orientation with respect to particular times. Okay, but it may also be the case that each individual time point here is only defined in terms of the events that have occurred or will occur there, that they have no way of thinking about these times independently of the events that are there. Well, why might we believe this? Why might we believe that children start out when they have this type of notion here with event-defined points in time? Well, I just want to finish with one last experiment, and then I promise I really will finish up. There's one piece of evidence that suggests that 4-year-olds don't seem to think as points of time as points in which any number of different possible events might happen. Could happen or will happen. Okay, and let me just describe this one experiment to you. This is so when we think about the future, we think of the future typically as something in which a myriad of different possible events might unfold. We also think about the past as having certain events have happened, but we also think counterfactually that, well, that event did happen, but a number of whole other possible worlds could have unfolded. It's not necessarily the case that that event had to happen. There could have been other things that could have happened as well. When do children realise this about event? When can they properly think counterfactually, and when do they appreciate that the future holds multiple possibilities? Now, I recognise that there's already been some discussion about determinism and indeterminism and so on. This is just looking at children's basic understanding of this. So this is the developmental psychologist equivalent of, I think, what we call the thin red line yesterday. Okay, well, it's not, but it looks like that. Okay. So here we've got an example of branching, but it's like a real physical branch here. In this experiment, what happens is a little mouse drops down the slide, and the mouse can go one way or the other. It can either go this way or that way. And in fact, which way it goes is kind of random. Not randomly, I don't know, I'm not talking about quantum mechanics or anything. Just as a matter of fact, it just goes down one way or the other. Now, in Beck et al.'s experiment, they asked children a number of different kinds of questions here, but the two that I'm going to mention that are critical are, first of all, they asked children what they called open counterfactual questions. So the mouse came down here, came out one of the sides of the slide, and then they said to children, could he have gone anywhere else? Okay. Now, the right answer there is to say, yes, of course, he could have gone down the other side. But she found that 3- and 4-year-olds typically said, no, he couldn't have gone anywhere else. More interestingly, because you might think, well, that's potentially a problem with language, she also said to them, okay, I'm going to drop the mouse down here now. We really want to make sure that this mouse doesn't get hurt. So I want you to put out some cotton wool at the bottom of the slides here to make sure that the mouse doesn't get hurt. Now, you can put out as many pieces as you want. Okay? The correct thing to do is to put out pieces of cotton wool at the bottom of each slide here, because the mouse could come down either way and you don't know which way it's going to come down. And what she finds is that 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, again, have great difficulty with this. So typically they will put out one piece of cotton wool here rather than 2 little pieces of cotton wool, suggesting that they don't appreciate that there's multiple ways that the future can unfold and that they actually don't know what those ways are. So, she argues in her paper that 3 to 4-year-olds potentially have difficulties because of their problems with these questions and thinking about thinking in terms of multiple possible outcomes, either with regard to the past or with regard to the future, rather than specific events. And so that might suggest to us that thought about the past and future in this age range is very much tied to specific events that have happened or that children speculate might or will happen. Okay, so let me finish off then. What I've tried to argue from the start is that we need 3 different distinctions to try and characterize the development of temporal cognition. In answering this question, development of priority perspectival or non-perspectival, well, I've tried to make the case that the answer that you give to that question depends upon whether you're considering orientation with respect to phase or with respect to particular times. If the event-dependent versus independent distinction, I do want to say that's a matter of degree, but we might see very basic forms of it even in relatively young children. And it's possible that it's in fact orthogonal to the orientation with respect to phase and with respect to particular times distinction.
Very interesting talk. The very first graph you had, did you ever try plotting that on log linear paper?
Whether that's a proper log, yeah, whether it's a proper...
it would be a straight line if you did it log linear paper.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if it quite would be when you came to the 2 points at the far end there. I mean, statistically, they don't actually differ from each other. But yes, you're right. I mean, it's that kind of shape. Yeah.
This is just the Weber factor law for any...
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Chris, do you want to jump on that?
Yeah.
That's a really good question, because there is this research by Standerheim, Elizabeth Spelker and colleagues, where they compared, I think, United States participants with an Amazonian people, in their judgments of duration of events, not distance from a noun, but actually the duration of, and what they did was they played a tone, and they got the participants to listen to the tone, and they got them to, using a simple computer graphics, draw a line which would indicate the relative length of each of the different tones and the different lengths. And they found that the spatial depictions in terms of length of the American students was simply a linear function of the length of the tone, whereas the Amazonian speakers, non-literate speakers, I mean, I don't think this has been replicated with other groups as far as I know. It was a logarithmic relationship.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
this is kind of a sort of interesting link between psychophysics and cognition here.
Well, just to say that, I mean, I don't know what the durations are. There is a big debate in the timing literature about whether humans represent time log in terms of log or in terms of linear. I mean, certainly, certainly there seems to be some ratio-based rule used if you ask people to compare different lengths of periods of time. How discriminable they are seems to depend on the ratio between them rather than the absolute difference. Whether you can turn that into a linear function, I think probably, I don't know, were the durations long enough in order to count in that study? Because once you can count, you can actually turn, once you can count, you can actually turn that log function into a linear function.
Dehaan and Spelker and Pika, they actually do relate this to number systems because the non-perspectival have only a small number system, 4 or 5, I think.
Yeah. So I mean, it may come down to simply the cross-cultural difference in terms of whether they're counting or not counting in terms of people.
I'll just bring in something completely extraneous. In cosmology, there's a debate about whether linear or log time is better to talk about the early universe.
I think we don't have much time for jumping on, so maybe David next.
Just about the experiment with the mouse and the chute. I'm wondering if there's another possible interpretation of what's going on to do with the developmental difference in capacity to compensate for your own ignorance.
Yes.
So, if you've got the chute coming down, I might think, well, maybe there's a fact of the matter which one's going to come down, but I don't know which one.
Mm-hmm.
And at one stage of development, I find myself thinking, I better find out which one it is. And that's what I'm concerned with. I'm going to put the piece of cotton on the one that's going to come down.
Yeah.
Then the next level of sophistication is, well, I don't know, so I can cover my ass by putting it in both cases, so it doesn't matter if I'm mistaken. It might be that piece of sophistication.
Yeah, I mean, they're epistemically children are in a strange situation there, and if you put children in a situation in which they have to make a guess, so if you said to them, I'm going to flip this coin here, and there might be heads or tails, make a guess, what do you think it's going to be? They say what do you think it's going to be, and then you show them, and it turns out they're right, and then you say to them, did you know or did you guess? Okay, children at this age will typically say, no, I knew it was going to be heads. So you're right, the children of this age do struggle to properly appreciate whether or not they're in a state of ignorance or not, and to properly acknowledge that as well when they're in a state of ignorance. So I accept that in this particular experiment there could well be an element of that going on. I mean, certainly they set the experiment up so that they did various kind of warm-ups so that children were entirely comfortable with putting out more than one mat, for example. So they kind of said, things are going to come out both of these shoots, I think. So, you put out both of them. So it certainly wasn't the case that children wouldn't feel comfortable about putting out one of the two mats. But you're right, epistemically, and appreciating that you're in that situation epistemically is something that they probably do have difficulty with at this point.
Okay.
At the beginning you said that the concepts of completed, ongoing, and yet to come were not the same as past, present, and future. Can you explain that? Because to me they're the same.
Okay. Well, I think what a psycholinguist person would say, and Chris did say this in part of the debate yesterday, is that if you're using a tense form, what you're doing is you're marking a relationship between 2 points in time. Okay, so that this event happened at this point in time, or this is the point in time now, and this is this is a different point in time, and this event happened at this point in time. So you're essentially marking a relationship between two different points in time when you're using tense. So that's the standard view of what tense use is. The alternative is that when children first start using tense, that they're not actually marking an event as having occurred previous to now, or as having occurred at a time different than now. They're simply saying something about whether the event has completed or not completed. Okay, so you might think that there's no distinction to be drawn there. You don't. Well, in the one case, you might say, well, if that's the proper analysis of what tense use is, then you actually have to have event-independent thought about time just to use tense, because you actually, what you're doing is you're marking a relationship between 2 points in time. But what I'm trying to push here is the idea that when children potentially, in the earliest stages, children are not marking a relationship between 2 points in time, because they can't actually think about points in time at all. Potentially what they're doing is they're just saying something, or marking something, or realizing something about the status of events that events have happened.
Right, so somehow there's a primitive, basic developmental skill that they, or whatever, awareness that they have that certain events are completed, ongoing.
This is the all gone phenomenon. You know, one of the, this is from really early child language work. In the 1970s, there was a kind of big debate about the meaning of this very common expression, all gone, and it does seem to mark disappearance of something, or completion, or accomplishment. Well, there are other, like there can be used as an accomplishment.
But it's, there is an agreement within the psycholinguistics literature about this also. There's some people who say that there's disagreement. Yeah, some people say that when children first start using the past tense, they are in fact already marking a relationship between points in time. It's a live debate.
Okay.
I was about to ask the same question. I didn't understand, and I still don't understand the distinction, but I'm wondering if it could be said in another way. That when you talk about the past, present, future, as opposed to the completed, or ongoing, maybe what you're saying is that children haven't learned to spatialize time.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying
because when you say 2 points in time, that sounds a lot like spatialization.
Well, if they're more, no, I'm not saying that. If you think about it in the case of the script, for example, if all they have is the script, okay, literally they cannot be marking the distinction between past and future. Because if that's all they have, they cannot be oriented with respect to past and future. Because they're only oriented with respect to a cycle that's repeating over and over again. Okay, so they don't, if that's all they have, they wouldn't at first glance anyway have any way of distinguishing between today's bedtime, yesterday's bedtime, and so on. So as a matter of fact, they can't be, if that's all they have, marking a distinction between past and future. They have to be marking something within the script itself.
Those Friedman experiments, the birthday test, that might be evidence for this kind of thing. That presumably it has something to do with the strength of memory of it.
Yes.
And all the events he was choosing were ones which would obviously be extremely vivid.
Yeah.
So that's one way of assessing distance from now. Surely the strength of memory, how strong is it?
Yes. Yes.
To support your point rather than Friedman, what Friedman thought, which I completely disagree with.
Yeah. To be honest, we think it's something like strength of memory, but actually, if you try and deliberately manipulate strength of memory experimentally in order to try and get children to make errors about the recency of items, you can't actually get them to do that. I've tried to do that myself. Okay. I have tried to do that. So, although I'm saying memory strength, the truth is we don't really know what it is or how to manipulate that. Friedman calls it a distance-based process, but whether it is something like trace strength, memory strength, vividness, or whatever, these kinds of errors would seem to suggest that, but we haven't been able to get in there and manipulate it in a way that proves that to be the case.
Maybe the last question.
I was intrigued by this data that might suggest that these children have problems in placing events in the future or the past. And I agree with your criticism on this data, but it appeared to me that all the questions that have been asked on these children were regarding events like Christmas, birthday, Valentine, Halloween, which are of course recurrent events every year, and therefore the confusion about whether they're in the past or in the future is almost very understandable and natural. So wouldn't it be interesting to try and repeat those experiments with asking questions about unique events that happens only once, like the grandmother's death?
There's been one study that has done that by Friedman as well. Unfortunately, he hasn't properly published it. He didn't describe it in a book chapter, and I think this is a study I'd really like to do again. He got the parents of the children to tell him unique events in the past and the future for those particular children. And then he used a kind of spatial display in which children had to assign events either to the past or to the future. And he again found that the 4-year-olds did make some kind of category errors under those circumstances, but unfortunately we don't have a good look at how exactly he did that. So I think you're exactly right there, that the children in these experiments, they're kind of forced to place events in a particular location. They may think of those events, they may be quite clear about whether those events happened in the past and future, but this is their way of expressing the closeness in time of these events. But you're right, no, I agree, and that's something that really should be returned to again in the empirical literature.
Maybe very last comment, sure.
Well, I had the same feeling of anxiety as yours, but I also felt that Christmas and summer holidays are much bigger events than Easter and Halloween.
You'd be
you really have to control for that.
Now, so you're talking about this particular study.
Them in mid-May.
Yes, I mean Christmas is the big thing for children, but it is true that Halloween is also a big event for them as well. I mean, you're right. You'd have to go back and ask them at a different point of time and have these as the future events and these as the past events. And we haven't done that as a crossover experiment. But you're quite right that should be controlled for properly, going back and testing at different times of the year.
But the thing is, you can only ask them about the future for things that are recurrent events. You can't.
When will Granny die?
I mean, but in the Friedman study I'm talking about, you did get parents to talk about events that might be unique. So your soccer game against a particular
first
team.
school day or
particular one of I think like when you something like when you get married was one of them, I think in the study or whatever. So but it is difficult. It actually is difficult to get parents to single out future events that children will understand what they're talking about when they mention them. And I think that's one of the difficulties with doing any of these sorts of experiments with anything other than these sorts of work.
Thanks, Teresa. For the number of illusions already.